From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the Chief of the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Library of Congress and the Hispanic Division. And it is even a greater pleasure to welcome Sergio Waisman, my compatriot from Argentina. Sergio is a professor at George Washington University since 2003. He has a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's from the University of Colorado in creative writing. He teaches comparative literature and Latin American literature. He wrote a book on Borges and translation, which I have to read, I'm sure. The Irreverence of the Periphery has translations of 6 books by Latin American authors, including The Absent City by Ricardo Piglia, for which he received a National Endowment Fellowship Award. His first book, Leavings, Irse, was a great success. He also translated Los de Abajo by Mariana Suela. We have 11 books in the library under his name. The commentators are going to be Gwen Kirkpatrick, who is professor and chair of literature of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Georgetown University. She has a PhD from Princeton University. She's the author of Dissonant Legacy of Modernism. She's co-author of Women, Culture, and Politics in Latin America. She has 9 books under her name in the Library of Congress. Laura Demaria is a professor of literature at Maryland University of Maryland. She studied at Universidad Nacional de Córdoba and has a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. She teaches 19th century, 20th century literature, history, politics, philosophy, and critical theory. Has published a collection of short stories and also Voces de Ceniza y Agua. She has 5 books in the library under her name. Sergio.
Thank you, Georgette. It's a real pleasure to be in the Library of Congress and to be with Sergio and Laura and Georgette. The Library of Congress is a very important place for me and for our students as well, and for the country and the world. Georgette stole a bit of my thunder, but I think I will go ahead and read it's somewhat different. Sergio Waisman is a translator, writer, and professor of Spanish and Latin American literature at George Washington University, and until recently liberated, he served as chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at GW. He did that a long time. His book, Borges in Translation, The Irreverence of the Periphery, has been published in English, Spanish, and Italian, and has become an indispensable reference for the study of Borges. As a novelist, Sergio has written Leaving, Irse, about a bilingual and bicultural life with wonderful baseball stories. That's what always stays. He integrates translation and the theory of translation into both his critical and his creative work. As Sylvia Molloy has stated, for Waisman, translation is a creative critical concept that signifies both a way of reading and thinking about literature. Sergio doesn't just translate contemporary fiction. He's taken on the task of 19th century, many different styles of 19th century works. He has translated for Oxford University Press works of Leopoldo Lugones, Juana Manuela Gorriti, Nathaniel Aguirre of Bolivia, and with Kelly Washburn, a collection of modernista prose and poetry I recommend very highly, including Delmira Agostini, the Penguin edition of the Mexican classic The Underdogs by Azuela, several novels and short story collections by Ricardo Piglia, whom we have today, and the writings of Juan José Saer, among others. He received an NEA Translation Fellowship Award for his work with Piglia's La Ciudad Ausente, The Absent City. Sergio received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA in creative writing from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And this is full disclosure. Sergio had a class with me when he was an undergraduate, and I also worked with him when he was in the doctoral program at Berkeley. I didn't direct his dissertation. I won't take credit for that, but I was on his committee. And it's a wonderful stroke of fortune that our lives have intersected again in Washington. At Berkeley, I remember that his research on Borges and on James Joyce impressed scholars from both Spanish and English. No small feat. His areas of research and teaching include Latin American literature and culture, with a focus on the Southern Cone, literary translation and theory, comparative literature, and Jewish Latin American literature. The novel he is presenting today, Target in the Night, won the Romulo Gallegos Prize for the Best Latin American Novel of the Year, very big prize. And in 2015, Piglia was awarded the Formentor Prize for a lifetime contribution to literature. Widely regarded as Argentina's most important living writer, for me at least, each of Piglia's novels comes as a surprise. Even though he often uses the journalist Emilio Renzi as a kind of alter ego in his novels, Renzi often has trouble getting to the heart of the matter. The novel at hand is partly an oddball detective story where a Puerto Rican charmer from New Jersey is murdered in a sleepy town in the Pampas in the late 60s. Unlikely. And partly a family saga of fortune, corruption, and perhaps incest. The late 60s in Argentina show signs of what will come later. Some isolated guerrilla plots, planning for the return of Perón, and the full-blown crisis that begins with Perón's return and death in 1974, then the long dictatorship. This novel only obliquely refers to political events, but it represents on a small town scale the reach of money, judicial corruption, and the sacrifice of entrapped innocents, or at least those who appear to be innocent. Gauchos, industrialists, beautiful, perplexing women, jockeys, Japanese Argentine hotel workers are just a few of the characters whose lives we encounter, some of whom, Gaucho style, are wary enough to say very little and make no waves. The detective, Croce, who seems to be the only one who knows the true story, however, talks and writes much too much, flooding the town with anonymous letters. Do we know too much or too little in the flood of information we receive? Whose words matter, and in which context? In retrospect, 2015, we know that this context, even in small-town Pampas life, was to be explosive. And this is what Sergio can explain. Thank you for your translation, Sergio.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Georgette. Thank you, Talia, for organizing, and Gwen and Laura for being here with me today. Translation is very difficult, a lot of work, a lot of time, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to arrive at this point. And there were plenty of times in the last few years where I thought I would never get to this point. So I'm so glad to be here. I know that a number of the people here also know Spanish, so I just want my idea is to read a little bit. I'm going to read the opening paragraph in Spanish and then switch to English. I'll read very briefly to give you a sense of the novel Blanco Nocturno, Target in the Night by Ricardo Piglia. Because the novel is a literary thriller of kinds, and because so much depends not only on the story but also the feel, the tone of the narrative, I wanted to read the beginning to give you a sense of what it's like. Also, I remember when Piglia finished this, and it coincided with a visit. I have this very clear image of him at his computer, turning back at me and to look at me, very excited because he had finished the first paragraph. He had the whole novel written, but he had finally finalized the first paragraph, and I could just see him right there looking back and reading the opening paragraph. And so I want to read that in Spanish, and then I'll switch to the translation. Tony Duran era un aventurero y un jugador profesional y vio la oportunidad de ganar la apuesta máxima cuando tropezó con las hermanas Belladonna. Fue un ménage à trois que escandalizó al pueblo y ocupó la atención general durante meses. Siempre aparecía con una de ellas en el restaurante del Hotel Plaza, pero nadie podía saber cuál era la que estaba con él, porque las gemelas eran tan iguales que tenían idéntica hasta la letra. Tony casi nunca se hacía ver con las dos al mismo tiempo. Eso lo reservaba para la intimidad, y lo que más impresionaba a todo el mundo era pensar que las mellizas dormían juntas. No tanto que compartieran al hombre, sino que se compartieran a sí mismas. So that's the opening of Blanco Nocturno, and the opening of Target in the Night. Tony Duran was an adventurer and a professional gambler who saw his opportunity to win the big casino when he met the Belladonna sisters. It was a menage a trois that scandalized the town and stayed on everyone's mind for months. He'd show up with one of the two sisters at the restaurant of the Plaza Hotel, but no one could ever tell with which because the twins were so alike that even their handwriting was indistinguishable. Tony was almost never seen with both at the same time. That was something he kept private. What really shocked everyone was the thought of the twins sleeping together. Not so much that they would share the same man, but that they would share each other. Soon the rumors turned into stories and elaborate tales, and before long no one could talk about anything else. People went on about it throughout the day, in their homes, or at the social club, or at the store and tavern. Everyone had a detail to add, commenting as easily as if they were talking about the weather. In that town, like in all the towns in the province of Buenos Aires, more news was batted around in a single day than in any large city in a week. The difference between regional and national news was so vast that the residents could retain the illusion that they lived an interesting life. Duran had come to enrich that in mythology, and his figure reached legendary heights long before the time of his death. You could take Tony's comings and goings through the town and draw a map from them. An outsider's ramblings along the elevated sidewalks, his walks to the outskirts of the abandoned factory and the deserted fields. He deciphered the order and hierarchies of the place in short order. The dwellings and houses stand clearly divided according to the social level of the inhabitants. The territory seems to have been drawn by a snobbish cartographer. The wealthy live at the top of the hill, and in a circle of about 8 blocks is the so-called historical center of town, which includes the square, the town hall, the church, and the main street with the stores and the 2-story houses. Finally, sloping down on the other side of the railroad tracks are the poorer neighborhoods where over half of the darker-skinned population lives and dies. Tony's popularity and the envy he aroused among the men could have led to anything. But in the end, his downfall was simply a matter of chance, which is what had brought him here in the first place. It was incredible to see such an elegant mulatto in that town full of Basque and Piedmontese gauchos, a man who spoke Spanish with a Caribbean accent, but looked as if he came from the province of Corrientes or from Paraguay, a mysterious foreigner lost in a lost town in the middle of the Pampas. And now I'm going to jump and just read a couple of very short fragments along the way to give you a sense of the novel without providing any spoilers, if I can. So, no spoilers. Ricardo Piglia, in almost all of his books, he has this recurring character, Emilio Renzi, who's an alter ego of types. He's also, early on in his career, Piglia also used Renzi as a pseudonym to sign some of his own works. So it's a very complicated double of the author. Renzi, in any case, goes to this small town to investigate this crime. And what he finds, what he investigates, is the crime. And it's a lot more than that. And locally, there's this Inspector Croce, as Gwen mentioned. And these two investigative figures carry out different kinds of investigations. And then at times they come together and discuss the intrigue that they're trying to resolve, and which is the intrigue that the reader is trying to resolve as well. And so this is a small part where Renzi and Croce are working together or discussing the situation together to try to figure out what exactly is going on in this town. Mm-hmm. When he spoke with someone, this is Inspector Croce, he was forced to choose certain thoughts. It was impossible to say everything. He always tried to have his interlocutor reflect with him and arrive at his own conclusions even before him. That was how he could trust his reasoning, because someone else would have thought it with him. In this, he was like everyone else who was too intelligent, Auguste Dupin, Sherlock Holmes, and needed an assistant to think with him and to keep him from falling into delirium. And Renzi comes to serve as an assistant, an intellectual interlocutor for Croce in the story of this crime. One of the hardest things to translate of this novel was actually translating the title, Blanco Nocturno. So Blanco, as most people know, is the color white, but that's not the only meaning in Spanish. Blanco is also a target, tirar al targo, dar en el tirar el blanco, dar en el blanco. And we went back and forth many times with the title. And whereas White Nocturne was a possibility, in the end, I went with Target in the Night, in part to try to, because the novel is very much about this target, and even though it's not always clear what the target is, and also there was something about the noirish feeling or the detective side, which seemed to work better with Target in the Night. And so this is one very brief section where the title is actually mentioned in Spanish. And so I wanted to explain this, and then you can hear how it sounds in English with the Target in the Night. So this is Croce and Renzi together. They're investigating. They headed out of town in Croce's car at midnight on a side road that bordered the district line toward Tapalqué. They drove across the countryside, avoiding the fences and the still animals. The moon was occasionally covered by the clouds, so Croce would use the searchlight attached to the side of his car, a bright bulb with a handle that could be adjusted by hand. All of a sudden, in the illuminated circle, they saw a rabbit, paralyzed by fear, white, motionless, like an apparition in the middle of the dark. Caught in the light beam, it was a target in the night. And now there's a footnote, and I'll read you the footnote. 10 years after the events narrated in this story, on the eve of the Malvinas War, Renzi saw in The Guardian that English soldiers were equipped with infrared glasses that allowed them to see in the dark and fire at targets in the night. As he read this, Renzi remembered that night in the country with the paralyzed rabbit and the beam of the searchlight from Croce's car, and realized that the war was lost before it had begun. That's the end of the footnote. This is Piglia's footnote, not mine. And now back to the narrative. It was a target in the night that they quickly left behind. They drove for several hours, bumping along because of the pits in the road, staring at the silver lines of the wire fences under the stars. Finally, turning off at a wooded path, they saw a glow from the lighted window of a country house in the distance. By the time they reached the source and were getting close to the small house, dawn was starting to break on the horizon, turning everything a pinkish hue. Renzi got out and opened the gate so the car could enter and go down a narrow road surrounded by bushes. A peasant was sitting on a bench under the house eaves, drinking mate. A patrol officer was dozing off nearby, leaning back against the tree. And then, so I'm interrupting myself at any point where I don't want to give away anything. Right, so it's hard to read from a thriller because I'd like you to get a little sense of the novel, but I don't want to give away the thrill of the plot. While he's in this town, there was mention of the Belladonna sisters from the beginning, and when Renzi goes to investigate his part of the investigation, he meets everybody in town and he strikes up a relationship with one of the sisters. And there are the novel, in addition to this thriller noirish tone, which hopefully you've been hearing as I've been reading along, it also has some other sections which are written in a slightly different style. And this is one of these. And here we have Renzi with one of the Belladonna sisters, with Sofia. Night had fallen over the house. They were still sitting on the chairs, out on the back porch, mostly in the dark, except for a small lamp behind them in the living room, looking out over the peaceful back gardens and the lights beyond. After a while, Sofia got up and put a Moby Grape album on the turntable and started to move, dancing in place to changes. I like Traffic, I like Cream, I like Love, she said, and sat down again. I love their band names, and I love their music. I love Moby Dick. That's what Renzi says. I'm sure you do. Take your books away from you and you'd be buck naked. My mother's the same. The only time she's relaxed is when she's reading. As soon as she stops reading, she's a nervous mess. Crazy when she doesn't read, not crazy when she reads. See her over there? See that light across the yard? There was a guest house across the back gardens with 2 large lit windows, through which one could see a woman, her white hair pulled back, reading and smoking on a leather armchair. She looked as if she were in another world. All of a sudden she took off her glasses, reached back with her right hand without looking to grab a blue book from a bookshelf out of sight. She put the page up against her face, then put her round glasses on again, settled back in the tall armchair, and kept reading. She reads all the time, Renzi said. She's the reader, Sofia said. And finally, another brief scene in which we have both Inspector Croce and Emilio Renzi together. So Croce says to Renzi, "You read too many detective novels, kid. If you only knew what things were really like. Order doesn't always get restored. The crime doesn't always get solved. There's never any logic to it. We struggle to establish the causes and deduce the effects, but we're never able to understand the entire network of the intrigue. We isolate facts, we stop in front of a few scenes, we question a handful of witnesses, but for the most part, we move blindly in the dark. The closer you are to the target, the more you get tangled in a web without end." Croce got up ceremoniously and gave him a hug. This is a point where they're about to split up. Then he thumped down again in his chair and leaned over his notes and diagrams distracted, as if Renzi were already gone. "The story goes on. It can go on. There are several possible conjectures. The story remains open. The investigation has no end. The investigation cannot end. Someone should invent a new detective genre. Paranoid fiction, it should be called. Everyone is a suspect. Everyone feels pursued." Thank you very much.
I'm short. Okay, thank you so much, Sergio Waisman, for letting me be part of this presentation. And I'm going to do, before we start, the way that we visualized this part was a dialogue between Sergio and myself. But before doing that, I'm going to do something that I tell my students never to do, that is to get inside the mind of the author and said what what he or she is thinking. And I'm going to get inside Ricardo Piglia's mind, and I'm going to say that he would have loved to be here. There is a quote that I have heard Ricardo Piglia quote many, many times. And that quote is from Faulkner, and it says as this: I wrote that book, The Sound of the Fury, Faulkner says, that Piglia says, that he says, and I learned how to write, how to read. I would like to repeat that with a torsion, and I would like to say that I read Ricardo Piglia's books, any book, and I truly learned how to read and how to write. So in a way, I feel that what has done Sergio Waisman with his translation of Ricardo Piglia's book is to let other people know how to read and how to write. So thank you, Sergio, for doing that. But now my first question has a kind of an introduction. And in El Último Lector, the last reader, at the center, we can visualize a writer that reads many books, but at the center of that book, there is a writer that writes and reads, but there is no library. There is a city and there is a cave. You could see, however, the plain relationship between a reader and a book. A scene, a reading scene, una escena de lectura, that it multiplies in many, many readers throughout the pages. Real readers, fictional readers, and you have Anna Karenina, you have Kafka, you have Borges, you have El Che Guevara, just to name a few. In that change of readers, in that change of scenes of reading, there are no translators. So here I proposed a different reading scene, una escena de lectura that is not at the El Último Lector. A translator reading a book. He or she is translating that book. A translator under a lamp reading a book in order to create, construct, displays that version he or she has in front. Or to put in another way, Sergio Waisman reading Piglia in his basement in Kensington. Reading Piglia word by word, sentence by sentence, advancing slowly into the book, not only as a reader, but as something else. That something else, that relationship between author and translator, is at the core of this new encounter. So Sergio Waisman, complete for us that close relationship between author and translator. You have talked about it a little bit with me before. We haven't rehearsed this, but I would like to know how a translator reads differently from us. We are all readers, but you read with a purpose. You read with a goal. And at the end, your reading materializes in something else, in a new book. And that's something that I cannot do. So that's my first question.
And so I think we're just going to, I'm going to come back to answer the question. So thank you, Laura. Right, so translation is very complicated. And I think I think I've dedicated my life to translating and my adult life to thinking about translation. So one of the things about the first thing that I would say is that for the most part, it is true that translation and the act of translation is very close to reading, and that the scene of translation is very close to the scene of the reader, and that's the perfect starting point. And in a way, it's also the perfect ending point. Much like reading, the scene of translation, a lot happens there, and most of it is invisible. So, I mean, not only because it happens in this basement in this suburb, but also because a lot is happening with two or more languages, two or more texts, two or more cultures, trying to bridge huge distances, linguistic, cultural, and also deciding what to do, trying to figure out what to do when the distances cannot be bridged. So I think one of the one of the truisms about translation, one of the things that's often said is that translators and interpreters are essential in order to communicate, to bridge differences and languages. And this is true. And yet, for me, one of the most interesting things about translation is noticing those differences and times when differences cannot be bridged or resolved. And of course, that's what interests us often about literature from other languages and other cultures, is the fact that it's different from our own language, our own culture. And the translator is in a rather impossible place in which he or she needs to be aware of these differences and yet somehow has to try to rephrase them in a way that they can be understood. And there's constantly a new production, a new creation in the translation, which threatens to leave something behind. There's different metaphors, different ways that this is expressed, and there's always a level of depending on what vocabulary you use, it will come out very differently. There's always violence in translation. There's always infidelity in translation. There's always betrayal in translation. Or you can say there's always bridges and new connections and new texts and new meanings and new possibilities for the future. And somehow both things are true. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. The last thing that I want to say is that it's true that the scene of translation tends to be invisible, and I take every opportunity I can to try to make some of that visible, because I think it's a very rich scene which would interest a lot of readers from a lot of different languages and perspectives. But translation, I am very aware that when I am translating something, I am writing my reading of another text. Right? I am writing my interpretation in another language, and that the moment I switch languages, there are these differences and points of conflict with the original that I've read, because as I write it, the best ideal translation would be the same text as the original. But that, of course, would be different also because time passes. And as Borges and Pierre Menard show, even if you don't betray the original gets betrayed by time. And is that betrayal or an infidelity or a production of new meaning and new possibilities? So I write my reading in another language. And if it doesn't work, it's a bad translation, everybody notices it, and everybody knows who the translator is. If it works well, then everybody remembers Piglia, and the translator fades into the much discussed and rather problematic invisibility of success, of writing the same thing again in another language, which by definition can't be the same thing. So anyway, it's a paradox. That's my answer. It's a paradox.
I have two more questions, and then we are going to open the floor. My second question has to do with what Borges called entonación, the intonation, or what we can be called the tone of a text, of el tono. And my question is very simple, because for me, how to translate the tono, the entonación, I don't know how you do it. Or do you try to reproduce that tone, that entonación, or you just try to create a completely new tone or entonación? Sorry that we have this.
No, so that's a good question. The tone, right? So, right. So the tone is very important. I think that the way that I want to approach this is a lot of people here know two languages. Some people here know more than two languages. We all have the experience or the anecdote that we are slightly different people depending on if I'm speaking English, if I'm speaking Spanish. There's the feeling that I'm slightly different, that there's a different tone to my communication, and yet I'm aware that I'm the same person. So with translation, I think that something similar happens. In simplest terms, when I translate Piglia, I try to imagine what Emilio Renzi, Piglia's alter ego, might sound like in English, what he could sound like in English, which of course doesn't exist before I do the translation, because Emilio Renzi exists in Spanish, and in a very particular tone and feel of Spanish, which is Rio Platense Castellano, from Argentina, and from Buenos Aires, and particularly from Buenos Aires, in the province of Buenos Aires. So I think it's a game of imagination, of trying to imagine. And in the best cases, the new tone or the new feel in the translation is something that will resonate, like the invisible pretext, the original, that if you read the translation, you know that there's something right before it. It will resonate with that, and hopefully it will also create new resonances in the target language, in English, in the US this time. But I think it's a game of, not a game, it's a challenge of imagination and of trying to imagine what, by hearing one tone in one language, what that tone might be in the other language. So I think that from that point of view, translation has the potential to be this other. Right.
My last question. It's very short, so don't sit down. You have talked about the irreverence of translation, but I would like to turn that irreverence into reverence. And there seems to me that in order to translate and be irreverent, first you need to be reverent.
Yeah, I think that there's two sides to it. So on the one hand, translators are expected to be extremely humble, to erase their own identity and their own voice, and to speak for the original author, and to be as reverent as possible. And in fact, that is part of the gesture of translation, to say, this, I am translating this text, this author, this merits being translated, merits my time, and it has a tone, and it has a feel and a story which is not mine, but so I will put my story aside in order to try to find a tone for this story from another language, to find a voice, now in English in the US. So from that point of view, translation seems to be very much an altruistic task. The translator removes him or herself and gives themselves over to the project of the translation, and with extreme reverence for the author and of the original. The flip side of that is the irreverence and the infidelity and the betrayals that always happen, because by definition, you're writing a different text than the original. And you don't have to be a translator who sets out to creatively rewrite and change the text in order to be irreverent. Translation is an irreverent task, because the novel is already here. So the fact that I'm writing this novel, that's irreverent. This is the original. This is the copy. And copies in society tend to be secondary and inferior and derivative. To what extent is the copy successful, meaningful, have its own life, its own readership? Well, to the extent that it resolves this tension between being reverent and irreverent, between being faithful and unfaithful, between trying to set my own voice and writing style aside in order to translate and rewrite somebody else's writing style, for whom I have such reverence that I am willing to leave my own aside, And yet, by doing that, I'm also being irreverent and betraying the original because I'm writing another text. So it's also it's also a contradictory gesture for sure. So yeah, do you want to come back or?
No, I'm just going to stay here. And my name is Yeva Nocturno, and thank you for your thoughtful comments and thoughtful questions. My question is about cultural differences that you mentioned that cannot be directly translated. Could you please give a couple examples from this book of such cultural differences that do not translate into English, into American culture? And then how do you then communicate them? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I think that one of the first examples that comes to mind is the figure of the gaucho and the whole mythology of the gaucho, which is at the core of Argentine literary tradition and at the core of important parts of Argentine history. And so, right, so is there an equivalent to a gaucho in the U.S.? Well, he's sort of a cowboy, but not quite. And the mythology and the now over 100 years of stories, both poetry and fiction, about the gaucho is a long tradition. And how Ricardo Piglia in the early 21st century is working with this figure of the gaucho who probably hasn't existed in reality since the 19th century, but in mythology and in storytelling in Argentina has remained a vital figure. So I don't know, it's not a good translation, but a good cultural analogy. It might be more like the mobster in Chicago, a figure about which, well, does it really exist? Like it's displayed in The Godfather, or is there a lot of storytelling and mythology about it? So that would be an example. And for some of these, so gaucho in English is gaucho. So sometimes the cultural references and differences, you can translate the context and the stories around them, and then sometimes certain words or certain concepts need to stay in the original. And I think that's what's happened with gaucho from South American Spanish into other languages for over 100 years. So sometimes the individual words or concepts those words maybe are not rewritten, but then the context around them does need to be reworked in order to be understood. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm Sandra Cyprus, formerly of the University of Maryland, but still affiliated, I should say. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sergio, Gwen, and Laura. I have so many questions. You really brought up so many things and paradoxes. But one of the things you did say briefly is that you worked with Piglia. Now, I know you translated Los de Abajo. You could not speak with Mario Alba.
No.
What is the difference for you for working with an author who is alive and who can make comments?
So right, so I've had both experiences of working with writers who are alive and with whom I can communicate dialogue in some way, like Piglia, and then some early 20th century or 19th century writers. So I think the theoretical answer is that there is no difference. That the translation. So other people mentioned my work with Borges. So that the translation is always a conjunction. It's always a surprising mixture and dynamic combination of the original and the translator producing this translated text, which then will have its new readers. So in some ways, it's not different because the translator has to do a tremendous amount of research to read the text, pursue all of the suggestions, possible meanings of the original. And in doing that, in that kind of reading, I think this might sound a little esoteric. So you initiate a dialogue with the text and its context and what you imagine it to be its horizon of when it was written and when it was first read, and you have an ongoing dialogue from your own horizon, from your own context. And I think that one has, I'm not sure, I think I have those kind of dialogues with what I read all the time, and it's with very few writers with whom I can actually have a conversation. How it's different when the conversations with Piglia is that, well, it complicates it complicates it because I can't be flippant about it. So when the reverent or irreverent question, I am hugely reverent, and having a chance to know him and communicate with him for over 20 years, that's increased my reverence, and that has everything to do with Piglia and what he's like and his work and how generous he is with people who have readings in common, who are interested in his work. And it very much complicates the fact that as a translator, I need to, at some point, be irreverent and break away from the figure of the author. And it's also very complicated because Piglia is very smart about translation, very aware of it. And so he knows that he's happy to have every conversation with me that we can, but then there will come a point where that needs to be broken off, and I need to take the text to its next horizon where there will be new readers in another language, and he has the faith or the confidence to know that it might travel. Yeah, and that from that point of view, I don't know if a mediator or a mule or something like that, to bring the contraband from Argentina to a new audience.
But for example, in the title,
Yes.
talking about, would
You're
you
right.
have taken that title if he had not liked it? What do you think you did?
It's hard to tell. So, Blanco nocturno, white nocturne, would be a literal translation. In Spanish, there's the binomial, Blanco nocturno, the white and night. If you reproduce the binomial, the white nocturne or white dark, it doesn't quite work. White nocturne is the title of a poem. Piglia's input into the title was that he said that he tends to avoid titles that sound overly poetic, and that's not what he had in mind with Blanco nocturno. Now, the problem with that is that it does actually sound poetic in Spanish. Right. So, I mean, I think that from a pragmatic point of view, he, as always, he was very generous. He wrote an email, explained what he had in mind, and said, "Of course, it's your decision." And I think that this throwing the onus, in this case, from him to the translator, I think this actually goes very much in line with Piglia's poetics, which is to write and circulate stories and throw them out for the reader to take up and interpret and then either circulate or think about. So I think the other thing that happens with Piglia is that he tends to be right. I think so based on experience, when he said, "Oh, white nocturne, that's pretty, but that it sounds too something, too flowery maybe," then I said, "Well, let me think about that." And so I do say "we" when you're right when I talk about the title, but in the end it was my decision, and the editor was okay with it. Yes.
Georgette.
Yes, please, Georgette.
I think actually the title is perfect because the other one would sound like music. White Nights, Leningrad. I mean,
Right.
It makes no sense whatsoever. So the title is perfect. And what I really admire most of you, how well you dominate both English and Spanish. I mean, a fondo. I think that's amazing. And you also bring to the American or to the English-speaking public what Argentina is like, which I think is very difficult. So I think that's really amazing.
Thank you. I think there are many outstanding translators who are not entirely bilingual, so that's a possibility. And there are many bilingual people who are not great translators. So I think it is true, but for me, part of it is the haphazard exiles and movings and comings and goings and leavings that I grew up with, and then it's also a lot of work. So I think that it's both things that the result of family and historical processes that made me bilingual, and then it's a lot of work at both languages in the translation. So I don't want to. It's not just that. Oh, I don't know if that makes sense. But thank you. Talia had a question. Yeah.
I have a question about process. So I want to take you to the beginning on how do you choose what to translate? I mean, the world is out there to
You're right.
translate it. So how do you make that choice? You mentioned reverence as one.
Yeah.
One of the choices. And maybe another question is: have you ever found a translation that you start and that process just goes nowhere? You have to say, no, this is where I stop. And yes, I think.
What's that?
Don't give names.
I know. So I think I'm also want to be upfront about the fact that I have a great job with tenure. So my process is different than somebody who is doing translations to earn a living as a translator. Before I had tenure, and especially when I was a graduate student, my first few years, there was less. There was less to the process. It was a project came up. Hopefully, it would be interesting. I would take it. Now I'm at a point where I'm able to be a lot more choosier, and I don't know that I can really categorize it. It's very subjective, and it has to do with a style or a tone, as Laura said, that I feel or I suspect is missing in English or in American literature, and it's my attempt to imagine that. So it's a perceived lack, but I don't mean this. I don't in any way mean to say that I know all of the different styles or tones that are available in American literature. So it's a perceived lack in myself that I try to address or travel towards by rewriting something that does exist, in this case in Spanish in Argentina. And yes, but for the most part, I tend to finish the projects. So I try to make that decision beforehand whether I will be able to to complete it or not. So thank you. Yes. Okay. Yes.
I'm Kathleen Balger-Barnett from Virginia Military Institute, and my question is, how do you move from project to project? Does it take you a while to take off your Asuela hat and put on your Piglia hat, or do you have to sort of the spiritual cleansing? how do you get Asuela out of your head and PA?
Well, I think because of the nature of the academics calendars and so forth, it tends to be more or less one project per year, more or less, and then centered around a lot of intensive work in the summers. So with the Mariano Asuela and Los de Abajo, the underdogs, I think that for 3 months, 2007 or 2000, for 3 months, I worked very hard to try to be an expert in Mexican Spanish from the time of the Mexican Revolution. And I wrote what I learned in English, which is the contradiction that I was. So I had all of these reference books in my basement in Kensington, and then I think part of the process. This is not something premeditated, but as soon as I finish the translation, I just leave it because I have written my reading. So it actually just sort of happens when I've written. If I hadn't finished the translation, it might not have left. But once I write my version, then I move on. And with Piglia, now this is the third book of his that I've translated into English. I'm hoping to continue with him with his work hopefully about one book a year for the next few years. So I think that with the flip side of that is I think that the engagement with Piglia's work and this tone that I don't have, that's lacking, which I'm trying to produce by translating his work, I think that's a lifelong project.
I wonder, do you find it difficult to translate the humor from one language to the other? I say this because many times, for instance, I read a page of Garcia Marquez in Spanish, and I find it so humorous. And then I asked a friend who has read it the same page in English. She finds it on the contrary sometimes. So I wonder maybe very difficult to translate, and sometimes, well, not in books, but when you see a movie and they translate a joke, it's so badly translated.
Right. So I think that's a good point. I don't have any advice on how to translate humor. The only thing that I would say is that once again, translation, if around this question, can work as a focus and a lens to the problem itself. So humor itself doesn't translate well even within the same language. So if you have to turn around and explain a joke to somebody, it's no longer funny. And so likewise, so it's translation, and it's noticeably difficult to translate humor, but it's also because, in a joke you're either in on the joke or not in on the joke, and so I don't know. Sometimes it translates and sometimes it doesn't, but I think that.
But do you find it difficult?
Oh yeah, very difficult. Very difficult. But like I say, I don't know that I have any solutions.
So much a joke is that underline that subtle kind of humor. For instance, especially English people have a special kind of humor. Very dry and very. So I think that. But no, I was wondering for you to try to explain to me if you find that the most difficult part or not.
It's definitely very difficult, and I think it's a case by case. In some jokes, some context, some humor, a solution comes up, and then it becomes, I don't know if equally funny or analogously humorous in the translation. Sometimes it doesn't, but I think I see it similar to the challenge of translating a tone. So the tone, the feel of this novel, the noirish feel in the pampas of Argentina. So in my mind, the analogous tone for that is something about 1950s cinema or crime in the U.S., which of course it's not something that I haven't lived either one of these experiences. So they're both projects of reading and imagination. Yeah. Sure, thank you.
My question is about how you see yourself in translation.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you've translated your novel yourself, that Marcelo Gwen translated your book on Borges, and that book was also translated into Italian.
Right.
So my question is, how does the translator see himself in translation?
I think honestly, it's different for each book, but I would like to believe that I will try to follow the model of Piglia as much as I can, which is if I am in the handful of times that I am fortunate enough to have a translator, either in the past or in the future, I will be very grateful and be happy to have the conversation and then let them do their work because it's their work. And I've already done my work. Of course, that doesn't quite apply to my novel, which I translated myself.
Were you faithful?
Can
we trust your Spanish translation?
Yes. And I think that I think it's also very different what language you're translating from and into. And so I think for Argentine writers, for Latin American writers to be translated in the U.S., it's hugely important for them. There's enormous geopolitical differences, financial differences. So there's and I'm with my own work. I'm not as a translator. I have a role in that market of trying to translate Latin American literature and put it in circulation in an American market, which is a huge market with a lot of potential writers. But with my own work, right? So if it gets translated to Spanish or Italian from English, I'm aware that I'm just glad that it's being translated. The relationship to the market is complicated. It would be another conversation, and where the translator is sort of a creative figure, but also a representative of the work, a little closer to the agent or the editors. I think it's complicated, and I think it depends a lot on the not only on the book, but then also in which direction the translation is going.
There's a question here. No? Christopher, and then you.
Yeah, Christopher Britt. I'm one of Sergio's colleagues at GW. And I wanted to go back to the scene of the translation that Laura introduced. And revisit in particular the idea of betrayal. The translator is treasonous. In part because it sounds like a lot of fun. Right? It's a space where we can finally be bad.
Right.
It sounds kind of sexy and appealing to be bad that way. But doesn't the need to be accurate complicate how bad we can really be, or how irreverent we can be, or how treasonous we can ultimately be, become as a translator, and still have the translation count as a good translation? I just wondered, how do you incorporate that question accuracy?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I want to be clear that I always try to be as accurate and as faithful as possible. I think the different works of translation are different, right? So of course, if you were working or serving as a medical interpreter, there's no, and the question is about the liver. There is no room for a creative infidelity in medical interpreting, right? Right. So I think that what I was saying before is very specifically to literature. And then maybe two thoughts. One is that because it's literary translation, and to the extent that this is going to be a generalization, to the extent that literature works with ambiguities and ambivalences and multiple different meanings, even in the original before you translate, then the question of accuracy or fidelity becomes very complicated because it's accurate or faithful to which meaning or which interpretation of the original. So I think that what the translator must do is be aware of the fact that he or she is, well, like any good reader, try to be aware of as many of the different meanings, suggestions, interpretations as possible of the original, and then be honest about the fact that one, in the end, will probably have to choose one of those. And this example with the title works very well. Blanco, nocturno, target in the night. I've chosen one of them. And then whether it will have an analogous amount or branches of new meanings in the translated language, that will be determined by the new set of readers. And the other side of the question is that, right? So again, as Borges and Pierre Menard shows, even all attempts to be as accurate and faithful to the original end up betraying themselves. So the betrayal isn't it isn't always fun. It isn't always like, oh, I'm really going to change this. Sometimes it's, oh, this, either these cultural differences or the language has changed, and in a way, this no longer means what it meant at the time of the original. So sometimes the accuracy, sometimes being accurate, sometimes the accuracy and exactness is itself not true or not possible. I think there's somebody in the back, or hi Anna, sorry I couldn't see you. Please.
To add to the conversation regarding betrayal, I think the larger question might be: is there any moment in language in which there's a fullness of meaning? You know, like what would fullness of meaning be in the first place? What would a moment in which you say a word and that word means everything it's supposed to say in any language at any moment, and then pass that to translation? You know, like translation is something that just complicates that.
Right.
So
I think it's true. I think maybe it's harder with individual words or phrases, but with other things like tone or feel, along with, in the case of fiction, the storyline, I think there's definitely a fullness of tone and storyline in the original, and you can get a fullness of tone and storyline in the translation, which will be the same yet very different from the original.
Thank you very much, and we do want to leave time to buy the book. Sergio's going to be signing outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.